Okay people, we're doing our next video on the concept of economic growth. So what is economic growth? Very simply, economic growth refers to the percentage change in real GDP over time, usually a year. If we're talking about positive economic growth, then obviously we're talking about an increase in real GDP over one year to the next. A recession, on the other hand, would be a case where there's negative economic growth. So if you were to negatively grow in height, then you would shrink. So if we have negative economic growth, it means that real GDP or output will fall over time. A recession has a particular technical definition, and it is that a situation where real GDP decreases for at least 9 months straight, so 3/4 of the year, or 3/4 of any period, there's falling output, then we say the economy is in a recession. Okie doke. So we could have a stylized representation of output over time to show what's called the business cycle. It used to be called the trade cycle. It's called the business cycle these days. So that would be a situation where you've got increasing output year after year, and then at some point output falls. So we've got economic growth occurring, output is increasing each year after year, and then we have a situation where the output is less than previously. So in this case we've got negative growth occurring. Then output goes up again, and then falls, goes up again, falls, goes up again. Alright. So this roughly represents the kind of pattern that you tend to find in all industrialized economies. That is, you'll have periods of growth punctuated by usually relatively short periods of negative economic growth, recession, then a trough, then the economy will start to recover again. So we say the periods where the output line is going upwards, we call that economic growth, and the periods when the output line is decreasing, we call them recessions. The bottoms of the recessions are troughs, and the upward sloping parts of the line would be, where there's growth occurring, would be recoveries. So when we're talking about economic growth, we need to calculate the real GDP and then measure the percentage change. So if you'll remember from previous video, we can calculate real GDP using nominal GDP, that is GDP measured in current prices, the market value of all final goods and services produced in a given year at current market prices, multiplied by the base year of 100 over the price index for the year that we're interested in. So let's say the nominal GDP is 250 billion. The base year for the price index, of course, is 100. But for our year, the price index is now up to 150. So we can rewrite. And then let's say the year after that, nominal GDP goes up to $280 billion. Base year is still 100. Divided by the price index has gone up from 150 to 158. So we can calculate the nominal growth rate. This is the increase in output. Sorry, the increase in nominal GDP. We can see it's 12%. How do you calculate that 12%? Well, that's simple. It's the same way you calculate any percentage change. New minus previous over previous times 100. 280 minus 250 divided by 250 times 100 will give you 12%. Anyway, so we can calculate real GDP. So the $250 billion, thanks to the deflation down to base year prices, is $167 billion. In the next year, calculating real GDP again, getting rid of the price influence, real GDP is $178 billion. Now we calculate the percentage change in that real GDP. New minus old over old times 100, and it gives us a real growth rate of 6.7%. So you can clearly see those growth rates are different. The growth rate of the real growth rate of 6.7% is telling us how much output has increased by over 1 year to the next. The nominal growth rate is telling us how much output has gone up by and prices have gone up by together. Alright, so we're really interested in the real growth rate, how much output has risen by. Let's go to indexmundi.com and see if we can find some real GDP growth rate data. Here we are again at Index Mundi. Go to Oceania, Australia, Economy, and we're looking for GDP growth rate. So GDP real growth rate, there we go, easy. Alright, estimated to be 3.6% for 2012. Let's have a look at the different growth rates. Let's say what's happening over time. Okay, so here's the Australian growth rate over time from 1999 to 2011. We can see there, starts off at 4.3, 4.6, goes down. 2003, it's 3%, bumps up a bit. So this is the rate at which output is growing. So you can see it's all positive. There's no recessions here. You can say that the growth rate falls and rises and falls and rises. That's the growth rate, but it's always growing. It's just growing at different rates. So at this point here, it's growing at 4.3%. So there's 4.3% more output in 2007 than there was in 2006. For 2009, the growth rate is 1.2%. So output increased by 1.2% compared to 2008. You can see that growth rate is obviously extremely small. The increase in output is extremely small. Well, in percentage terms anyway. Let's look at a country comparison, just for fun, to get an indicator of how Australia rates compared to other countries. So here's our economic growth rate. Let's see what period's that. That's from 1961 up to 2011. Now let's compare that. We want to compare it with another country. So what's another country we can compare Australia's growth rate to? A country which is similar to Australia might be Canada. So let's put in Canada's growth rate. Okay, that's not dissimilar to Australia's. You see it has roughly the same sort of patterns. Alright. What about, let's think of another country we could compare ourselves to. How about Greece? Alright, so as we can see recently, compared to Greece, we're quite different. You can see Greece clearly has, from 2008 onwards, has negative economic growth. It's almost 0%, and it goes to negative 3% and negative 4.9%. So not good news for Greece. What if we compare Australia to our nearest neighbour, Indonesia? Right, we can see through the 1970s that Indonesia's growth rate is higher than Australia's. In the mid-1960s, it was relatively low, very low, 1%, roughly 2%, and certainly lower than Australia's. However, thanks to the military coup and subsequent dictatorship, which was sanctioned by the United States, where President or General Suharto took over the government and ran the country as his own personal business, we can see that economic growth shot up rapidly from the 1970s onwards. However, the country was extremely corrupt and nepotistic, and eventually suffered a massive fall in output in 1998 when there was an Asian currency crisis. Maybe I'll say a little bit more about that when we come to look at the causes of economic growth, or not, as the case may be. So let's go back to our slides. So what are the factors that affect economic growth? What factors can cause an economy to grow faster, or slower, or shrink? Well, given the resources and the technology and the level of education that a country has, and assuming some of those resources are unemployed, you can increase output by employing more of those resources. Now, assuming we're not talking about a command and control economy, a socialist, purely socialist economy where the government simply employs the people, here what we require is demand expressed in the form of expenditure in the society for goods and services, in order to entice firms to produce more goods and services, and in order to do that they would need to employ more people, which they could do because there's some unemployment. So if there is an increase in aggregate demand for goods and services, total demand throughout the economy, then firms respond by increasing output. Real GDP rises. That would give you economic growth. And vice versa. If aggregate demand were to fall, the demand for goods and services were to fall, firms would respond to that decrease in the demand by decreasing their production. Obviously they're not going to produce goods which they believe no one will buy, so they'll cut back production. Real GDP would fall in that case, and if it fell for a long enough period of time, say 1 year, then we would say the economy is in a recession. But going back to our case of increasing output via an increase in aggregate demand, now it assumes that by increasing aggregate demand, that means that firms can employ more workers, for example, the unemployed, to produce goods and services. But what if all the resources that you have in your economy already are employed? Can you still increase output in that case? Well, the answer is yes, you can. You can increase the amount of output that can be produced in an economy if you're at full employment already, only by increasing the aggregate supply of goods and services, or the capacity to supply goods and services. If you can increase that capacity, that potential GDP, then, assuming you subsequently increase aggregate demand, you can further increase growth. So how do you do that? How do you increase the capacity to produce more or increase potential GDP? Well, there's a list. First on the list is by decreasing the prices of inputs. So, for example, if you can establish a society in which you have slave labour, such as in Bangladesh, for example, where people routinely work for about $1 or $1.50 or $2 per day, then firms can afford to purchase more inputs in order to produce more goods and services. You could also increase the productivity of existing resources in order to increase productive capacity. So what does productivity mean here? Productivity simply means the capacity to produce more output with the same amount of resources as before. That is, the resources are capable of producing more than they previously were. So, for example, if you educate labour, then labour workers are able to produce more than they previously could. If you have some kind of technological innovation which enhances raw materials in some way, so that more can be squeezed out of the raw materials than was previously the case, then that's increasing the productivity of the raw materials. An example might be, if we take the raw material of say, soil, is if you administer a fertilizer to it. That's a technological innovation. It enhances the productive capacity of the soil. Capital here for economists means plant and equipment, machinery, tools. So if you have some kind of technological innovation which increases the productive capacity of a factory, of tools, of equipment in some way, then that will increase overall productivity and enable an economy, assuming it occurs widely enough, will increase the potential output for the economy as a whole. Lucky last, or not quite lucky last, second to lucky last, you could increase the quantity of resources available in your economy. So how can you increase the quantity of resources available? Well, if we're talking about labour, an easy way of increasing the quantity of resources available is by immigration. If you import more people, then you have more labour available to produce more goods and services. It doesn't mean that the economy will produce more goods and services, but it does mean it has a greater capacity to produce more goods and services than previously. Also, if you increase the natural population growth rate, people had more babies, then over time that will result in increased productive capacity of the country, simply because there'll be more young people running around who could be put to work. Back in the good old days, the way you would increase, and by the good old days I mean the terrible old days of feudal times, so any time before, say, 1600, a major way in which, well, they would be empires and kingdoms back then, major way in which empires increased the available resources of labour was by means of the institution of slavery. So you would invade another place and you would enslave the population, and then you've increased your productive capacity. Raw materials. How can you increase the quantity of raw materials available to your economy? Well, one way is by discovering more raw materials in the ground. Or, after discovering raw materials in the ground, say uranium, and beating off demands for environmental regulations and concerns about the beauty of Kakadu National Park and so on, after you've dealt with all of those issues, you could then say, well, we can now have available to us these resources, which we can then transform into output. So this would be increasing the productive capacity of the country. Another way you can increase the quantity of resources available to a nation is by good old feudal methods again, invading another country and simply laying claim to its natural resources. So if you invaded another country, say you needed, I don't know, some essential raw materials such as, I don't know, crude oil, and let's say it would be advantageous to your economy to have at its disposal more crude oil, or the more crude oil would be available to, say, its corporations anyway. Then what you could do is you could invade that other country which has crude oil, stacks of it, set up a puppet government which will agree with everything that you demand, and then you can proceed to pump the oil out to the advantage of your corporations, the corporations of your country, and ultimately, hopefully, to your own country. You increase your productive capacity in that way. Of course, that wouldn't happen today. I mean, that's barbaric and completely uncivilized, and only the most backward and horrifically morally degenerate people would ever try doing something like that. But back in the past, that was a very common practice. Another one is capital, that is machinery, plant and equipment. Can increase the quantity of plant and equipment by the process of investment, that is by simply the purchase of more plant and equipment. There's a nice picture of a mine. Lucky last way in which you can increase the productive capacity of a country is by increasing the efficiency of how markets operate. So if you can eliminate red tape, eliminate or decrease the number of restrictions on business behaviour of various kinds, having more streamlined bureaucracies, eliminating, well, the list goes on, eliminating various kinds of monopolistic or anti-competitive behaviour on the part of corporations, then that's a way in which you can increase the productive capacity of the country. If you're conducting business, if you're conducting production in a private property market-based system, if you're engaged in production, by doing it in the most efficient manner, you will be increasing the productive capacity to a greater extent than would previously have been the case.